Hello, good afternoon. We start with breaking news. In the last hour, it's been announced that the UK and India have agreed a free trade agreement. The government says the deal will add £8 billion to the UK economy and slash Indian tariffs on products like whiskey, cosmetics, and medical devices. Earlier, the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, stressed the significance of the deal. This is a historic day for the United Kingdom and for India, because this is the biggest trade deal that the UK have done since we left the EU, and it's the most ambitious trade deal that India has ever done, and this will be measured in billions of pounds into our economy and jobs across the whole of the United Kingdom. So it is a really important, significant day, and look, it's been promised many times over the last 8 years. Prime Minister Modi and I decided in Brazil last year that we would move at pace in relation to these negotiations. We've done that in a serious way, in a pragmatic way. And we're able to show that that's what delivers results. So I'm really pleased for working people across the country who will feel the benefits of this, of course, at an increasingly uncertain time in terms of trade and the economy across the world. So this is a very significant step, and I'm very pleased that we've got this far. With this really significant trade agreement, the Indian Prime Minister also posted a statement on X, saying in an historic milestone, India and the UK have successfully concluded an ambitious and mutually beneficial free trade agreement, along with a double contribution convention. These landmark agreements will further deepen our comprehensive strategic partnership and catalyze trade investment, growth, job creation, and innovation in both our economies. And he went on to say, I look forward to welcoming the Prime Minister Starmer to India soon. Our political correspondent Liz Bates joins me now. Christ, very keen to get on the airwaves and say how successful this is, but there is no doubt about it. This is positive news for the UK economy. Oh, it absolutely is. And you can see the Prime Minister there making the most of it, making this announcement from number 10. As he said, no trade deals are often years and years in the making. There's a lot of back and forth behind the scenes negotiations, and clearly this government has made this trade deal a priority and pushed it over the line. In quite a short period of time, as you say, what it will mean for UK consumers and businesses are things like it will be cheaper to export things like whiskey, cars, cosmetics. It will also be cheaper to import goods, some goods from India, things like clothing and footwear. You saw the Prime Minister hailing this deal. We've also heard from the Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds. He says this is a massive, massive moment for UK companies and consumers. Just to give you a sense of how important this is for the UK economy last year, trade between the UK and India was worth about £41 billion. This will add around £25 billion by 2040. So really, really significant for the UK economy. As the Prime Minister said, the government hailing this as something that will boost growth and create jobs, which of course is something this government has really pinned their period in power on. This was a big promise during the election. They really want to see growth in the economy. The context, all of this, of course, a U.S. president and a U.S. Government that is protectionist, that is disrupting world trade, and of course, the UK economy is still readjusting post-Brexit to leaving its biggest trading partner in the EU. So, unsurprising then that the UK government is trying to make the most of this, I think, over the next few hours and the next few days, there will be scrutiny of this deal, and in particular, the question over whether it changes anything in terms of immigration policy between India and the UK. Does it soften any kind of visa arrangements? Will we see more immigration from India? That's what political opponents will be looking at. But the Prime Minister wanting to make the most of this, we also saw the Prime Minister of India saying he looks forward to welcoming Prime Minister Starmer to India and will be keeping an eye on Liz. Thank you very much. Well, let's talk now to director at the communications firm, SEC Nuate, and former advisor to the Business and Trade Secretary, Ali Renison. Ali, how significant is this boost? And do the government's figures add up here? Well, I think in terms of the suite of trading partners that the UK has been negotiating with since leaving the EU, India is by far the most potentially economically transformational to do an actual trade agreement with, particularly because of the size of its market, its growth rate, and also, very frankly, India has some very high both tariff and non-tariff cost to overseas companies that are trying to trade with it and do business there. And this is one of those kind of, I think, rare, occasions where a trade deal really can make quite a big difference. The question about numbers, I think it depends on how many businesses are actually able to use the agreement. And that will depend on what we see in the texts in the coming days and in terms of the success of the negotiation. As you point out, India, a very different kind of economy to the UK, quite a protectionist economy. How significant then is it that the government managed to reach this deal with them? Well, I think India has also been on a bit of a sort of journey under Prime Minister Modi itself to open itself up. It wasn't really a big fan of doing trade agreements, whether it's, very, very high, over 100% sort of tariffs on whiskey imports to some of the kind of domestic regulatory requirements that basically make it very difficult or certainly costly for legal services, financial services firms in the UK and other countries to do business in India. I think a lot will depend on what does the text say about, what kind of non-tariff regulatory barriers have been tackled as part of the agreement. So the scope for sort of significant economic sort of uplift as a response to this is there. But a lot will depend on the detail. How quickly do you think we may feel the benefit in the UK? Ultimately, it depends on how quickly the tariffs will come into force. So, for example, we know that with other trade agreements, particularly in sensitive sectors like agriculture, there's a sort of phase-out period to tariffs. It'll be interesting to see whether, for example, even in something like whiskey, has India agreed to cut its whiskey import tariffs immediately, or is that over time? And I think those are some of the questions that will sort of, determine ultimately how quickly businesses can take advantage of those provisions. A lot of fanfare being made about the fact that this is the first significant free trade agreement since we left the EU. Now that we have this one in a back pocket, do you think others will follow quickly? Well, we have Australia, New Zealand, those are the sort of the main ones done so far. There's also been a couple of digital agreements with Singapore. I think the next big one to look for potentially is one lined up with the Gulf Cooperation Council. The Gulf countries that's supposedly being close to being finished, and that's also sort of, in some ways, a very closed market to a lot of services. So, big opportunity for UK exporters in those sectors. Obviously, the big one, even though we already have a trade deal with the EU to come, is what's going to happen with this sort of new EU reset and the sort of the trade ambitions that the UK and the EU have there. I think that's probably the biggest one on the horizon outside of Europe. And does this change the fact that we now have this deal? Will it make the EU regard us any differently? Are we more or less attractive to the EU now to deal with? Well, interestingly, the EU is doing its own negotiations with India. They've been going on since about 2008, on and off. So I think they will certainly feel the impetus to try and get their deal done, albeit certainly some of our businesses will be looking to see if, when that deal is complete, do European exporters get granted any sort of better access to the Indian market than the UK did. But I think that the EU is now coming around to the fact that, ultimately after Brexit, and after, movements in the White House in Washington, that it's trying to diversify its own sort of FTA trading links with other countries. So I think we're in the sort of the same mix as the EU at the moment. The government is saying that this has been 8 years in the making. I wonder, were you at all involved in negotiations around this, conversations around this? And during your time in government, it was certainly ongoing during my time in government. It kept me very busy. And I think it's interesting to see that some of the stumbling blocks, which no doubt the opposition will be having a look at, to see what concessions were made. How those were dealt with. For example, the carbon border tax that the UK is introducing, that the EU has, India wanted to get an exemption from that. Is that dealt with in this sort of trade agreement? And also sort of issues around visas and labor mobility. What kind of concessions, if any, were made to get us over the line? Yeah. And it's interesting because Kistan was asked questions about both of those by journalists after it was announced. And he sort of pushed back and said that, there weren't going to be exemptions necessarily on visas. And certainly hadn't made concessions as about carbon tax. So it does sound like, those hurdles have been crossed, and that the government has got a pretty good deal for the UK in terms of what the UK will hope to get. The devil will be in the detail. I think it's worth stressing that it's not just the UK that wanted to get this done under a new government after an election. Modi obviously was sort of, his party was re-elected after its own election. And I think there was a sort of drive from both sides to say, let's not make perfect the enemy of the good. Let's see what progress we can make to get the deal over the line. Ali Renison, really good to talk to you. A former policy advisor to the business and trade secretaries. Good.